When you think about life, I mean, the sheer complexity of a rainforest or a human brain, it's so easy to get caught up in the big picture. But if you really drill down,
Way down.
way down, exactly, everything, and I mean everything, comes down to a set of tiny invisible rules, the rules of chemistry.
It's so true. And you see those rules play out in the most surprising ways. We're actually starting today not with some huge complex organism, but with a tiny one. The wood ant, Formica rufa.
Right, the ant that literally shoots acid.
It does. When it feels threatened, it just sprays this volley of formic acid straight from its abdomen. It's an incredibly potent defense.
And that defense only works because of the chemistry. The shape of that molecule, how its atoms are arranged, that's what gives it the power to inflict pain.
Precisely. The molecular structure dictates the biological function. And that's really the core of our deep dive today. We're looking at the sources on the chemical context of life, laying out the absolute fundamentals, elements, atoms, bonds that form the bedrock for all biology.
So our mission is to establish those rules. We're starting small, with subatomic particles, and building our way up to the complex reactions that make life possible.
Yep. If you get these rules, you're basically learning the foundational language of life itself.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute basics. Matter. Anything that takes up space and has mass. And matter is built from elements.
Right. An element is, a pure substance that you can't break down any further by chemical means, like carbon or gold.
And when you combine two or more different elements in a fixed ratio, you get a compound, like HO water.
Always 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen,
Yeah.
or NaCl, table salt. Always that 1-to-1 ratio.
And this is where we immediately hit one of the coolest ideas in all of biology, right? Emergent properties.
Yes, the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The compound has totally new characteristics that its individual elements just don't have.
Table salt is the perfect example they
It
use.
really is. You take pure sodium. It's a metal that explodes in water,
And pure chlorine is a straight-up poisonous gas.
a toxic yellow-green gas. But you combine them in that perfect 1-to-1 ratio, and you get edible table salt, something essential for life. The interaction creates something completely new.
It's just wild that our bodies literally require this combination of a poison and a highly reactive metal.
And that kind of chemical necessity is everywhere. The sources point out that when you look at life, just 4 elements make up about 96% of all living matter.
Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, the big four.
That's them. Oxygen at 65%, carbon at 18.5%, and so on.
But why those four? What's so special about them?
It really comes down to their atomic structure. Carbon especially is the MVP. Its ability to form 4 stable bonds means it can build these huge, complex chains and rings, the very architecture of life's molecules.
So proteins, DNA, all that stuff.
Exactly. And then you have hydrogen and oxygen, crucial for water and energy, and nitrogen for proteins and nucleic acids. The rules of chemistry basically pre-selected them for the job,
Okay, so after the big four, there's a supporting cast. Calcium, potassium.
making up most of that last 4%. And then you get into the really tiny players, the trace elements.
Required in absolutely minuscule amounts, but if they're not there.
It can be a catastrophe. Take iodine. You need the tiniest bit for your thyroid hormone. If you don't get it, your thyroid gland swells up into what's called a goiter.
All from a microscopic deficiency. It just shows how chemistry works on every scale. But it can also be harmful, right? Not all elements are friendly.
Oh, absolutely not. The sources mention arsenic. It occurs naturally, but if it gets into the groundwater, it's highly toxic. It's a perfect example of chemistry's double-edged sword. An element's properties dictate whether life can use it or if it will be harmed by it.
Okay, so to really understand why these elements bond the way they do, we have to drill down even further, right? Inside the atom.
Yep, down to the subatomic level. The atom's the smallest unit that still has the properties of that element.
And it's made of 3 key particles for our purposes. Protons, which are positive,
Neutrons, which are neutral.
and electrons, which are negative. Protons and neutrons are packed into that dense central core, the nucleus.
And the electrons are zipping around that nucleus in what we call an electron cloud. They're the particles that are actually involved in chemical reactions.
Now, in terms of mass, protons and neutrons are the heavyweights. They're each about 1 Dalton. The mass of an electron is so tiny we basically ignore it.
Right, and an atom's identity comes from its proton count. That's the atomic number. Carbon always has 6 protons. If it had 7, it would be nitrogen.
And the mass number is just protons plus neutrons. So for sodium, atomic number 11, mass number 23, you just subtract to find it has 12 neutrons.
And that brings us to isotopes. All atoms of an element have to have the same number of protons.
But they can have different numbers of neutrons.
Exactly. So you get different versions of that element. Carbon-12 is the most common, stable form, but carbon-14 has 2 extra neutrons, and that makes it unstable.
Unstable means radioactive.
Right. Its nucleus spontaneously decays, and it gives off energy. In the case of carbon-14, a neutron turns into a proton, so the atom actually transforms from carbon into nitrogen.
Which is incredibly useful for us.
Well, unbelievably.
Mm.
In medicine, we use these radioactive isotopes as tracers. A P-scan, for instance, uses a type of radioactive glucose.
Because cancer cells consume glucose faster than normal cells.
Precisely. So the radioactive tracer accumulates in tumors and lights them up on the scan. It lets you see metabolic activity in real time.
This is where it gets really mind-bending for me, because that predictable decay isn't just for medicine. We can use it as a clock, radiometric dating,
It all hinges on the concept of a half-life.
which is the time it takes for 50% of the original, or parent isotope, to decay.
And that rate is absolutely constant. It's a perfect clock. For carbon-14, the half-life is 5,730 years. That makes it perfect for dating things like fossils that are up to, say, 75,000 years old.
The source gave this great example of dating a Neanderthal fossil. They found it had only about 0.78% of the carbon-14 you'd expect.
Okay, so if you do the math, after one half-life, you have 50% left. After two, 25%. Three, 12.5%. You keep having it.
And 0.78% works out to be somewhere between 6 and 7 half-lives.
Right, which gives you a very precise age for that fossil. And that data was, absolutely critical for figuring out the timeline of when Neanderthals and modern humans might have overlapped.
It's just amazing. But let's get back to the living atom. It's the electrons that run the show chemically, and it's all about their energy.
Right. Think of potential energy as stored energy, energy of position. Like water at the top of a dam has high potential energy.
And electrons have potential energy based on their distance from the nucleus.
Exactly. But they can't just be anywhere. They exist in fixed energy levels called electron shells. It's like a staircase. You can be on step 1 or step 2, but not in between.
And an electron can only jump up a step by absorbing a precise amount of energy or fall down by releasing it.
And here's the absolute key to all of chemistry. An atom's behavior is determined by the electrons in its outermost shell, the valence shell.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, atoms are, sort of, driven to have a full valence shell. The first shell is full with 2 electrons, the second and third with 8.
So if an atom has a full outer shell,
It's happy, it's stable, it's chemically inert, like neon or argon. They don't react with anything. But if its outer shell is incomplete, it will desperately seek out other atoms to share or transfer electrons with to achieve that full shell stability.
and these electrons aren't just randomly orbiting. They're in specific regions of space called orbitals.
Right. An orbital is just a 3D space where you have a 90% chance of finding that electron. The simplest are spherical orbitals. Then you have dumbbell-shaped p orbitals.
And each orbital can only hold 2 electrons max. Understanding those shapes is about to become very important.
So that fundamental drive to fill the valence shell is what creates chemical bonds, the attractions that hold atoms together.
Let's start with strong ones, covalent bonds. That's all about sharing electrons, right?
All about sharing. If 2 atoms share 1 pair of electrons, it's a single bond, like in a hydrogen molecule, H zeros. If they share 2 pairs, it's a double bond, like in oxygen, over-rho.
In an atom's bonding capacity, its valence is just the number of bonds it needs to form to get that full outer shell.
Exactly. Carbon has 4 valence electrons. It wants 8, so its valence is 4. It's destined to form 4 covalent bonds.
But the sharing isn't always equal, is it? This is where electronegativity comes in.
Yes. It's basically a measure of how strongly an atom pulls on shared electrons. A tug of war for electrons.
So if 2 atoms are evenly matched, like an H arrow, they share equally.
And that's a nonpolar covalent bond. The charge is distributed evenly across the molecule,
But if you have a big bully like oxygen,
which is highly
it
electronegative.
hogs the electrons. It pulls them way closer to its own nucleus.
Right. And that unequal sharing creates a polar covalent bond. In a water molecule, the oxygen becomes partially negative, and the 2 hydrogens become partially positive. This polarity is, it's arguably the most important property for life on Earth.
Okay, so what happens in the most extreme case? When one atom is so much more electronegative, it doesn't just hog the electron, it steals it outright.
Now you're talking about an ionic bond. Take sodium and chlorine. Chlorine is so electronegative, it just rips sodium's single valence electron away.
So sodium becomes a positive ion, a cation, And chlorine becomes a negative ion, an anion.
And the ionic bond is simply the electrical attraction between those two opposite charges. They stick together like magnets.
But it's important to note these ionic compounds, or salts, form crystal lattices, not distinct molecules, and they're much weaker in water.
They are. The polarity of water gets in the way and breaks them apart easily. Now, if those strong bonds build the molecules, it's the weak interactions that give them their final shape and allow them to talk to each other.
And number one on that list has to be the hydrogen bond.
Absolutely. This is the attraction between that partially positive hydrogen atom in, say, a water molecule and a nearby partially negative atom, like the oxygen on a different water molecule.
So it's not a true bond that forms a new molecule.
No, it's a much weaker, fleeting attraction. But when you have billions of them, they're strong enough to hold the two strands of your DNA together or fold a protein into its correct shape.
Okay, and then we have the weakest of the weak, van der Waals interactions.
These are fascinating. They're just temporary attractions that happen because electrons are always moving. For a split second, you might get more electrons on one side of a molecule, creating a temporary dipole.
A tiny, fleeting pocket of charge.
Exactly. And that can attract a neighboring molecule for an instant. They're incredibly weak individually.
But again, it's a numbers game. This is how a gecko walks up a wall.
That's the perfect example. It's not suction cups or glue.
Yeah.
It's the cumulative effect of billions of these tiny van der Waals interactions between the microscopic hairs on its feet and the surface of the glass.
Wow. And that all comes back to molecular shape. The shape determines the function.
It's everything. Those S&P orbitals we mentioned, they hybridize or mix to form specific geometric shapes. Methane forms a perfect tetrahedron. Water has its famous V shape.
And that shape is how molecules recognize each other, the lock and key model.
Yes. Think about endorphins, the body's natural painkillers. They have a very specific 3D shape that allows them to bind to receptors in your brain.
And drugs like morphine work because their shape is so similar to the endorphin shape.
They mimic it perfectly. They're like a counterfeit key that fits the same lock, so they can bind to those same receptors and produce a similar pain-relieving effect. It's all about shape.
So molecular shape dictates function, and that function happens through chemical reactions.
Which is just the making and breaking of chemical bonds. You start with reactants, and you end up with products. But matter is always conserved. You're just rearranging the same atoms.
Photosynthesis is the classic example. Plants take in carbon dioxide and water.
And using energy from sunlight, they rearrange all those atoms to create glucose and oxygen. Nothing created or destroyed, just reconfigured.
And a key point is that all chemical reactions are, at least in theory, reversible.
They are. And the rate of the reaction depends a lot on concentration. The more reactants you have, the more they collide, and the faster the forward reaction goes.
Which leads us to maybe the most important regulatory concept in all of biology. Chemical equilibrium.
Yes. Okay, let's unpack this because it's a bit tricky. Equilibrium does not mean the reaction has stopped.
Right. It's not static.
Not at all. It's a highly dynamic state where the rate of the forward reactants becoming products is exactly equal to the rate of the reverse reaction products turning back into reactants.
So things are still happening, but there's no net change. The overall concentrations of reactants and products have stabilized.
They've stabilized at a fixed ratio. And it's so important to stress that ratio isn't necessarily 1-to-1. You could be in equilibrium with 99% products and 1% reactants. It just means that ratio is now stable.
And this is how life maintains balance, or homeostasis.
Exactly. If reactions just ran to completion in one direction, your cells would either run out of essential materials or get clogged with waste products. Equilibrium ensures a steady, regulated state where everything is maintained at the concentrations needed for life to keep going.
So, to pull it all together, we've gone from the very building blocks of matter.
The elements, yeah. Realizing that life is built, 96% from just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen.
We looked inside the atom, saw how valence electrons dictate all of chemistry, and how we can even use isotope decay as a clock to measure deep time.
And we saw how atoms link up, the strong covalent and ionic bonds that build molecules, and then those crucial weak interactions, hydrogen bonds, van der Waals forces, that give large molecules their shape and allow them to recognize each other.
And it all culminates in these dynamic chemical reactions, which are constantly seeking that stable, balanced state of equilibrium. It's the set of rules that governs a wood ant just as much as it governs us.
Right. So to really synthesize all of this, let's leave you with a final thought to explore. Think about the bombardier beetle. It defends itself by spraying this boiling hot explosive liquid.
Okay.
Now, the sources explain that the beetle actually stores two different sets of chemicals separately in its glands. It only mixes them at the last second for that explosive discharge.
I see where this is going.
So the question is, using the principles we've discussed, molecular shape, bond stability, reaction rates, how can you explain why the beetle isn't harmed by the stored chemicals? And what exactly causes that violent, boiling hot reaction the instant they're mixed?
That's a perfect way to tie it all together, structure and function in action. Well, thank you for diving deep with us into the chemical context of life.